Hi, Dr. Versalati here, and in this screencast we're going to review some of the sources of influence on the interlanguage. Now, when we think of interlanguage influences, we might first think of the L1. There's a difference between how the L1 has a structure than found in the L2, and maybe the learner is having a difficulty because the L1 is interfering with the L2 development. And we have found that there are some patterns that tend to happen in the interlanguage of learners who share in L1. But it is important to remember that differences between the L1 and the L2 don't always cause a problem. Let's look at one specific example. So in English, we can say things like I see them, where the pronoun object is after the verb. Now in French, that same meaning would be expressed with a pre-verbal pronoun. You can see that in the examples, the pronoun object is underlined. Now, learners of English L1, learners of French, will produce an incorrect form trying to use the English word order when they're speaking French. So we do see that pattern, but we rarely see the opposite. French learners of English rarely produce I, them, see. So what this shows us is that differences between the L1 and the L2 are not always creating symmetrical problems. It may be asymmetrical, where learners of one language have the problem, but the reverse does not have the problem. Another important thing to think about is, although some learners who share the L1 have a problem, we might also see that same pattern shared by learners from different L1s. And we also might see that same pattern in L1 development before we even get to an L2. So what could be causing that influence on the interlanguage? Well, it could be just general developmental patterns. There could be systematic developmental ways to try to resolve a difficulty when speaking, such as limited working memory, right? We can't pay attention to everything while we're learning, and some things might be dropped. So how would we know if it's an L1 influence or a general developmental pattern? Well, first would be to look at the L1 and the L2. Is the structure not in the L1, or is it very different in the L1 and therefore it might be difficult in the L2? Maybe, then it could be an L1 influence. But even if that's the case, we want to also compare L1 development, say, of English with L2 development of English. So if it is the L1 influence, we wouldn't expect it to be also in the L1 development of monolingual learners. So that's one possible influence, but there are other ways that patterns that might be shared across L1s. And it could also be because of language learning strategies that are used. For instance, it's a very common pattern, both in the L1 and in second language learning, that a pattern that is known to the learner gets overgeneralized. For instance, the past tense marker on verbs might get put on a verb that normally would not be heard with that past tense marker, like run. And the same thing might happen with the plural marker of nouns in English. You might see children or learners of English say things like dears or furnitures or homeworks. and that's overgeneralization. Another pattern might be redundancy reduction. So in a sentence like, I have 2 cats, the word 2 already conveys the information of plural, so maybe that redundancy is not necessary, so the learner simply says, I have 2 cats. The other example would be if you ask someone, hey, do you like pizza? And the learner responds, yes, I like. That is the fully conveys the meaning, and the learner didn't say, I like it, because it's understood. So that, but of course, not all missing morphemes are redundancy reduction. Another pattern is called simplification. That's when the message is conveyed with less language. It's more of a basic variety. And it could also, simplification can also be in the case where the learner is expecting a one-to-one correspondence between form and meaning. So if, for instance, the be verb is functioning as a linking verb, it might be hard for a learner to understand that it could also function as the auxiliary for a progressive aspect or something like that. So how can we tell the difference between redundancy versus simplification? Well, redundancy reduction could be a more active choice because the information is conveyed somewhere else in the message. But for simplification, there is no redundancy that's being reduced. It's just created with a more basic form. Now, how can we tell whether it's a general developmental pattern or a learning language strategy? Since the language learning strategy allows us to be more specific, it makes sense to appeal to these when explaining interlanguage, because we can see these patterns in the interlanguage. And again, I want to stress that not all simplification is redundancy. For instance, subject-verb agreement in English is not a redundancy reduction. So, but there are more possible potential interlanguage influences, and one is the markedness principle. And this could happen in the L1 or in the L2 among different L1s, learners of different L1s. What is markedness? So it's a theory in linguistics where some structures and constructions, features of language are unmarked, meaning that they're more common, more frequent, less complex, while other forms are less frequent. They're more complex, they're marked, they're a little bit more unusual in some way. For instance, the th and the v sounds are marked because those sounds are very rare across languages. They're difficult to pronounce. You really have to exert effort to stick your tongue between your teeth. And you'll see that children have difficulty with that, and also learners across many different languages have difficulty with that if in English L2 speech. Also, relative clauses, especially specific types of relative clauses, are marked. And again, all learners have trouble with the marked forms rather than the unmarked forms. So then how do we tell whether it's the markedness principle or general development patterns? Well, one thing we can consider is avoidance or underuse. So if it's driven by markedness, we would expect maybe more underuse of it or avoidance of that construction or that feature. We're going to probably reserve markedness for when it's a clearly identified markedness feature. And the last thing we might want to consider about what influences our interlanguage is the input. the language that is seen and heard, experienced by the learner, right? Input, both in L1 and the L2, is influences the language that we learn and the language that we produce. Most of the time we can consider input, it's been done in the L1 by considering the caregiver's speech, and it's been done in the L2 by looking at the language that the L2 learners are exposed to, say in textbooks. And we can also just think about corpora data, like what is more common, what is more likely to be heard and seen by learners. Okay, so just to recap, if you claim that L1 is driving a particular pattern in the interlanguage, we would expect all learners with that same L1 would have that same error. And at the same time, we would expect learners of English that come from a different language background would not have that same pattern, right? Both of those conditions would be required in order to claim that the L1 is probably driving that pattern. So lots of things that we reviewed. So if an interlanguage pattern is shared by the L1, learners who share the same L1, it could be L1 influence, but we want to consider the relationship between that structure in the L1 and the L2, because some relationships are easier and some relationships are more difficult. We also could consider input. This is especially for instructed learners, maybe with the same teacher. And some interlanguage patterns differ among L1 learners, maybe because of different input or because they're at different developmental stages or they're using different language learning strategies. And some interlanguage patterns are shared by many learners, both while learning their L1 and while learning an L2. And that could be because of general developmental patterns, limitations on working memory, and access and knowledge, and some things could be language learning strategies like overgeneralization, simplification, the redundancy principle, and it could also be the markedness principle at work when it's a pattern shared across many learners. And just to look forward to the next unit on development, overgeneralization and simplification are often described also as interlanguage processes.